Welcome! In this tutorial, we will learn how to create new expense entries in CrossConcept Continuum. CrossConcept Continuum allows us to create expenses associated to projects and under different categories, which can be used later for financial reporting or invoicing purposes. From the left menu, we go into Expenses, and under the Expense Entry group, we select Expenses. The Expenses Summary screen opens, including three tabs. Draft Expenses, where we can create our own expense entries and keep them in draft mode. Submitted Expenses, which will list the expense entries that have been submitted for approval, as well as those expense entries that are already approved. And Received Expenses, which will list the expenses that have been already approved and paid to the employee. In the Draft Expenses tab, we have a list of columns that will be populated when created a new expense entry. The same columns can be displayed in the right side by clicking this hamburger icon at the top right. This opens the Expense Details panel, which will also allow us to create new expenses by filling the information in the fields and then clicking the Add New button. In this example, we will create a new expense entry by filling the information in the main area, so we will collapse this right panel by clicking the hamburger icon again. First, we click the plus symbol located under the Expense Type column. The drop-down displays a list of the expense types that have been configured by the company in the system, so this list could vary depending on the settings of each organization. They are grouped by expense categories, such as transportation or telecommunication. In this example, we will select the taxi expense type. Next, we need to select the project we want to create the expense entry against. This list will display all the projects to which we are assigned to, or the projects for which we are the project managers or project editors. Then, as an optional selection, we can choose a specific task associated to the expense entry. In this example, we will select the task Status Meeting. By selecting a project, its associated account is selected by default, and we cannot modify it. Since we have not saved this draft expense yet, the expense status column remains blank. Then we can select the expense date, which by default displays the current date. We can navigate to different months and years as required. Next, we need to define the quantity of the expense entry. In this example, let's say our expense will cover 2 taxi trips, so we enter the number 2. In the expense amount column, we need to specify the amount of each taxi trip, so we enter, for example, 25. Please note that the expense total is calculated automatically by multiplying the quantity times the expense amount. Then we specify the expense currency, which by default displays the currency that was configured in the project. Depending on the currencies configured by the company in the system, we will be able to select a different currency from the list. Similar to the currencies, if the company has configured different taxes, we will be able to select a tax to be applied to this expense. If no tax is required, then we can select the option as No Tax. When selecting a tax from the list, the following 2 columns are calculated automatically: tax rates and expense tax amount. If required, we can also specify an exchange rate. Next, the grid displays the reimbursable total and the reimbursable currency for this new expense entry. If required, we can enter a description in the comment column, which will be visible to the corresponding approver. There is also a rejection comment column, which will display any comments made by the approver in case the expense entry is rejected. Finally, we can click this icon to attach a file to this expense, such as a PDF or text file, the scanned receipt, or a printed email related to the expense. This file will be also visible to the corresponding approver. Now that we have filled all the required information, we click the Save button at the top. If later on we need to discard any changes, we can click also the Revert button. The expense entry has been saved, so we have new options available under the Action column. We can delete the expense entry by clicking the X icon. We can pin the expense entry, and we can copy the expense entry to generate a new record. In this example, we will create a copy of the expense we just created, so we click this icon. Then we click Yes in the confirmation message. A copy of the expense has been created, so we can just edit any information as required. For example, we can change the expense date and the quantity. Then we click the Save button to save the changes. As we just saw, once we create the first expense, it is very easy to create subsequent expenses by using the copy function. Now that we have 2 expense entries, we will submit them together for approval under the same expense report. we select the two expense checkboxes in the left, and then we click the Submit button. The Submit Expenses Report dialog box opens. Here we can select date for the expense report, which by default is today's date. Then we can review the expense report details such as the number of line items, the tax amount, and the reimbursable total. We can also change the currency of the expense report and type a general comment for the expense approval. If required, we can also attach a file such as a scanned receipt. When we are ready to submit the expense report for approval, we click the Submit button. The system displays a message informing the unique ID for the saved expense report. By clicking OK, the Submitted Expenses tab is displayed automatically, showing the new expense report at the top of the list. By clicking the arrow at the left, we can review the two items we just submitted under the same expense report. If the list of expense reports is long, we can use the filters at the top of the columns to narrow the results. Likewise, we can sort the results, add or remove columns, and apply advanced filters if required. If we want to discard any submitted expense report, we can click the X icon located under the Action column. This will set the submitted expense reports back to the draft status, so we will be able to modify them and resubmit them, or we could delete them if required. As we can see in the grid, the status of these two expense entries is submitted, so the status of the overall expense report is also submitted. Once all the expense entries are approved, the status of the expense report will change to approved, and we will be able to mark it as received. For example, the status of this expense report is approved. So under the Actions column, we have this new option called Receive. When clicking it, and then clicking Yes in the confirmation message, the expense report is removed from the Submitted Expenses tab and is placed under the Received Expenses tab for reporting purposes. Any rejected expense entry will appear back in the Draft Expenses tab in red font color, including a rejection comment, and we will be able to modify it or delete it. In the three tabs, we will be also able to export the grid in Excel and PDF formats by clicking these buttons at the top right. We hope you find these instructions useful in your work with CrossConcept Continuum. Thank you for watching this tutorial.